My name is Mary, and I'm nearing my late 50s. I have 2 children. My older son is now an adult with a job and is planning to marry his girlfriend soon, while my daughter is in college. She studies hard but also seems to be really enjoying her time at university. With my kids growing up, I feel like my role as a mother is almost complete. As a former nurse, I'm considering going back into caregiving. Then, I received shocking news. My father-in-law, Bob, had a stroke. My husband, John, called to tell me, and I rushed to the hospital where Bob was admitted. Bob has always been kind and gentle, and he's treated me very well, but I've been concerned about him since his wife, Alice, passed away 3 years ago. He seemed down and low on energy since then. I would visit him occasionally and noticed he didn't seem like himself, so we often invited him out with the kids to lift his spirits. Recently, he'd been showing signs of feeling better, so news of his stroke really worried me. When I got to the hospital, John's sister, Isabella, and her husband were already there. I rushed over and asked how Bob was doing. Isabella seemed annoyed and replied, "You're late. We have somewhere to be, so can you stay here instead?" Then she left quickly. Isabella has always been a bit distant toward Bob, and she was the same with Alice when she was alive. Although Bob and Alice were always kind to her, she never seemed to appreciate them. I waited anxiously while Bob was in surgery. After a while, John arrived, looking worried and exhausted. When he asked if Bob was okay, I shook my head, and John's face went pale, but I quickly told him, "No, he's still in surgery. We don't know yet." John looked a little relieved, then sat down in a chair, still visibly upset. I tried to comfort him, putting my hand on his back, but I didn't really know what else to say. A few hours later, the doctor called us into a small room to give an update. He told us that Bob's surgery was successful, but he would likely need long-term care due to some lasting effects of the stroke. We realized that if Bob needed care, it would involve the whole family, including Isabella and her husband. John and I decided to call Isabella to discuss it, and we agreed to meet at Bob's house to talk about how we could help him once he was discharged from the hospital. As soon as we started discussing Bob's care, Isabella bluntly announced, "I'm not going to look after him," shocking both John and me. "What? If you're not going to, then what are we supposed to do?" I asked. "I don't care, you two can take care of him," she replied dismissively, fiddling with her perfectly manicured nails. Her husband, Tom, nodded in agreement. "What about a nursing home?" "What? Why would I waste money on that?" she snapped. I felt her glaring at me, as if I wasn't allowed to have a say, so I stayed quiet. John looked frustrated. "If he can't go to a facility and you won't look after him, then what are we going to do? That's why you two should take care of him. I'm not having an old, sick man in my house," Isabella said with a smirk. I lost my patience. "That's enough, Isabella. He's your father." "So what?" she said, unfazed. "Just because he's my father doesn't mean I have to look after him. Besides, he's John's father too. I've been saying you should look after him." There wasn't much we could say to that. John and I would have gladly cared for Bob, but our home isn't designed for someone with mobility issues. There are many stairs and uneven floors, and we don't have the money to remodel. "Mary, don't you have a caregiving certificate? Taking care of him should be easy for you, right?" Isabella asked, smiling smugly. John and I were both at a loss for words. We decided to end the discussion for now and left. "What are we going to do?" John asked, looking worried. "I don't mind caring for your father," I said gently, "but if we do, we'll need to make the house safe for him, and that's expensive. Medical equipment isn't cheap either." "You're right," John sighed. "I wondered if making our house suitable for Bob would cost around $100,000. That's just an estimate, but if we adjust the entire first floor to meet his needs, it might be close. With our eldest daughter still in college, we don't have that kind of money, and we're still paying off our mortgage. The thought of taking out another loan for renovations is overwhelming." I feel terrible, but should we consider a nursing home? The problem is, the waiting lists are long, and the fees are high, and I know Isabella and her family won't help financially. I couldn't see a clear solution. We decided I would talk to my father-in-law directly to get his opinion. When I went to visit him in the hospital, he looked much better and greeted me with a smile. "Sorry for all the trouble," he said, like he always does when I visit. "Don't say that. I brought one of your favorite books today," I replied, placing it on the table for him. After his stroke, he lost movement on the right side of his body, so he has to prop books up and use a weight to keep the pages from turning. "Thank you," he said, putting the book by his pillow. "Dad, I came because I wanted to talk about what comes next, I said. He gave me a warm smile. Oh, I know. I'll be okay even in a nursing home. I've saved up for it, so please don't worry. He tried to sound positive, but I noticed a hint of loneliness in his expression. Well, Dad, if you'd be comfortable, why not come live with us? I said, trying to cheer him up. I used to work in elderly care, and since I'm at home, I have the time, and John is there too. That's a kind offer, he said, looking surprised but touched. I could tell he felt he wouldn't be able to go back to his own house, where Isabella and her husband are now living. I imagined how they might treat him as a burden if he returned, and it made me sad. I'd originally planned to just listen to his thoughts and decide from there, but I ended up inviting him before even consulting John. I felt a bit guilty, but I knew John would understand. Now, we just needed to figure out the logistics of his care and, most importantly, the cost. With that in mind, I decided to try consulting Isabella one more time. I went home and told John what had happened at the hospital. He looked a bit concerned, but he seemed to understand and agreed, as if he'd already guessed it would come to this. Right then, John called his sister, Isabella. That's why we're asking for your help, since we'll be the ones looking after Dad, I overheard John say. They seemed to argue on the phone, with John sounding frustrated. Finally, he sighed and hung up. John explained that Isabella had refused to offer any financial help, and there was nothing more we could do about it. Determined to find a way, John and I started discussing how we could handle the costs ourselves. Our home became a bit hectic as we talked about remodeling for accessibility, figuring out what care supplies we'd need, and learning about different options for home care. Later, when I told my father-in-law he'd be living with us after he left the hospital, he looked both happy and a little apologetic. Mary, could you bring the checkbook from that bag over there? He asked during one of my visits. Curious, I did as he asked. Then he opened the bank book and handed it to me, saying, I have some money here, can you and John use it? The balance in his account was far more than I had ever imagined. When I just stared in surprise, my father-in-law laughed and said, You and John are going to be taking care of me now, right? I heard you're getting a new car and making the house accessible. Would $10 million be enough? $10 million. I was shocked. I had no idea he'd saved so much. Apparently, after my mother-in-law passed away, he hadn't felt like doing much, so he decided to put his energy into investments he'd been learning about for years. My father-in-law's investments had gone surprisingly well, and he saved money quickly. Since he wasn't a big spender, his savings just kept growing. Even with the cost of remodeling the house and getting a new car, he really didn't need all that money. I handed his bank book back and said, I can't accept this much, please keep it for yourself, but he held it out to me again, saying, I have more than I need, I'd rather give it to you and John, since you're willing to take care of me. After a bit of back and forth, I still felt uncomfortable accepting such a large sum. Seeing my hesitation, he thought for a moment, then suggested, what about $1 million? I managed to convince him to settle on a more modest amount, $100,000. He still seemed a bit disappointed, but he agreed. Just then, Isabella suddenly walked in, completely unaware of our conversation about the money. Quickly, I tucked my father-in-law's bank book back in its original place. Isabella frowned and asked, What's going on? Sounding slightly concerned, though it was clear she hadn't heard anything. It turned out she had just come to drop off some clothes for her father. I felt relieved she hadn't overheard our talk about the money. After chatting for a bit, Isabella and I left the hospital together. On the way home, she suddenly said she wanted to talk and suggested we stop by a coffee shop. Since her talks usually aren't pleasant, I was hesitant but agreed, which turned out to be a mistake. I'll take care of Dad, she announced out of nowhere. Her offer left me shocked, especially since we were already in the middle of preparing our home for him, even starting the renovations. Confused, I asked, Why now? She replied casually, So you don't need to visit him at the hospital anymore. Her response didn't make sense. There's no rule that only the caregiver should visit. Something about her sudden change didn't sit right with me, so I suggested we talk about it another time and left the cafe. When I told John about it at home, he thought it over and suddenly seemed to realize something. She must have overheard about Dad's savings, he said. It made sense. Otherwise, there was no reason for her to suddenly want to care for him after being so against it. We both suspected she'd found out about the money and was trying to gain his favor to inherit it. I worried she might even start making excuses to spend it on herself. But what should we do? I asked John. I have an idea. Let's let her give it a try, he replied with a sly grin, hinting that he had a plan. Although I felt uneasy, I decided to stay quiet and go along with Isabella's request for now. I explained to my father-in-law that he didn't need to worry about money and that his daughter Isabella would be taking care of him. He responded with a vague look, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. With that, our conversation ended, and he was discharged from the hospital and went back to his family home in Nebraska, where Isabella lived. After his discharge, I visited the family home. The house didn't seem prepared for proper caregiving. There were no renovations or adequate supplies. I doubted that real caregiving could happen under these conditions, but since Isabella had insisted, I kept quiet. 2 months later, I got a frantic call from Isabella. "Mary, I can't do this anymore. Please come over right now." I rushed to the house in Nebraska and found it in disarray, with a foul odor hanging in the air. Isabella looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and an unsteady walk. "Are you okay?" I asked, worried. As I hurried over to her, she grabbed my hand and said, "Take him away." At first, I didn't understand, but after calming her down, she explained. She had completely underestimated the demands of caregiving, helping with walking, meals, and even managing his incontinence, which required changing diapers. It was all too overwhelming for her. I told her I couldn't make a decision right then, but promised to get back to her soon. Back at home, John wasn't surprised. "She lasted 2 months, that's impressive," he said, glancing at the calendar. He'd expected this outcome. He suggested we go pick up his father on his next day off, and I agreed. A few days later, when we arrived at the house in Nebraska, my father-in-law was already packed and ready to leave. I felt relieved that we could finally bring him home with us. As we were about to help my father-in-law into the car, Isabella suddenly said, "I've endured for 2 months, and I used to live here too, so I deserve at least $5 million. Her comment shocked me, and I stopped in my tracks. John also seemed taken aback and turned to look at her. She had a smug look on her face. "What are you talking about, Isabella? This isn't the time or place to talk about money, especially not in front of Dad. He raised us." John tried to reason with her, but it didn't seem to affect her. "I'm his daughter. It's only fair that I get paid," Isabella said defiantly. I couldn't believe how bold she was being. "Enough, Isabella, you shouldn't talk about such things, especially after you've already received money," I said, trying to stop her. My father-in-law, looking shocked, added, "There's none left, just $5 million. What's so hard about that?" I was stunned. How could she speak like this to her own father? Even John, usually calm, looked furious. His face was red as he glared at her. John tried to stay calm, but my father-in-law, Bob, spoke up to ease his son's anger. "It's okay, John, she's speaking the truth." Then, Bob turned to Isabella with a cold expression. "Isabella, you are no longer my child. Leave this house." His words were so harsh, and when Isabella heard them, she froze in shock. What are you talking about? I'm your only daughter," she exclaimed. "I only have one son, and this kind, caring woman here is my daughter-in-law. I don't know who you are anymore. Take your foolish husband and leave," Bob said firmly. I was shocked. This was the first time I'd ever heard my father-in-law speak so harshly. He was usually soft-spoken, but now his eyes were hard and unyielding. Isabella seemed stunned and didn't dare respond. "Well, shall we go? I'm counting on you moving forward," Bob said, his voice returning to its usual warmth as he looked at me with a smile. John and I followed his lead, leaving Isabella standing there, speechless. Later, Bob arranged through his lawyer to ensure his inheritance would go only to John, so none would go to Isabella. After Isabella moved out, leaving the house empty, Bob suggested that John and I move in, and we happily agreed. Isabella and her husband, it turned out, had been spending a lot of Bob's money even while he was healthy, and their careless spending had led them into debt. Now, they struggle to make ends meet. I can't help but feel this is the natural result of how Isabella treated her father. Taking care of Bob is challenging, but with my caregiving experience, it doesn't feel like a burden. Our family is able to enjoy a good relationship and a peaceful home life together.